Good morning, everyone. I'm Zach. If you haven't met me before, I'm the teaching and young adults pastor here at New Vine. And I'm stoked to be able to share with you this morning. As Jill mentioned, we're continuing our Wiser series and looking at the book of Proverbs. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with a bit of a question. Have you ever had someone just kind of get under your skin a little bit? You know what I mean? Like someone who just for whatever reason, maybe they said or did something that just kind of annoys or irritates you. It doesn't need to be a big thing. Maybe it's just a small, you feel a little bit irritated by them. But I mean, of course, I'm sure none of you feel like this. None of you would ever get annoyed or offended by anyone. But let's just pretend, let's just pretend that perhaps sometimes you get annoyed. What do we do in times like this? What do we do when something that someone does just kind of stirs up something within us? Now, I don't know about you, but I have definitely said some things that I regret. I have definitely spoken too quickly, and it's kind of like I can see the words leaving my mouth, and I just want to grab them and gobble them back up again, or just have a clicker to reverse time or something like that. So I've definitely said some things that I regret. But then there's other times where I feel like this, and I just shut down. I cover up how I'm feeling, and I just try to avoid the conflict. I'll be like, oh, no, it's fine. Things like this. And sometimes it's just easier to be nice than to be honest. But then those feelings sometimes linger. And even though I've pushed it down, it's still there. And sometimes it leaks out in the way that I talk, in my tone, or in the way that I treat people. And so what do we do in times like this? What do we do if we speak too quickly? We might end up stirring up conflict, and that's not helpful. But if we don't speak at all, sometimes those feelings leak out in other ways. Well, this morning, what I'd like to do is take a look at Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18. So if you have your Bibles or Bible apps with you today, I encourage you to open it up there. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18. And we're going to return to this proverb and these questions in just a moment. But before we do, I'd like to just spend some time setting the scene and reminding us of some important things when it comes to reading the book of Proverbs. So as John mentioned last week, as I mentioned a moment ago, we're spending a couple of weeks in our Wiser series. So this is a sometimes series. It's a series that we're going to come back to sometimes throughout the year, where we're looking at the book of Proverbs. And last week, John took a theme, the theme of money, and explored a few different proverbs which address that theme. Today, I want to focus in on one proverb and look at the way that this one proverb interacts with some other proverbs and interacts with our own lives. And so we're just going to be zooming in on this one proverb, chapter 10, verse 18. But first, when it comes to reading Proverbs, there's something really important that we need to remember. There's something really important that we need to keep in mind whenever we're reading Proverbs, whether they are modern Proverbs that we use today or ancient ones. And that's this, that Proverbs are general truths presented in an absolute way. Proverbs are general truths presented in an absolute way. So let me kind of unpack what I mean by this. They're general truths, right? They're not absolute truths. Proverbs are, as DJ mentioned earlier this year, ways of working with the grain of God's good creation. And so they're general truths. But this is true not only of ancient proverbs, but of modern ones too. Even modern proverbs are general truths presented in an absolute way. So let me give some examples. We'll say, look before you leap, but he who hesitates is lost. We might say, many hands make light work, but too many chefs spoil the broth. We might say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but it's never too late to learn. And so, which one of them is true? Well, if they were absolute truths, then one would be true and the other would be false. But the reality is, they are true, but they are generally true. And this is also the case in Proverbs in the Bible. So I think John mentioned this last week as well, is these Proverbs from chapter 26. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you'll be just like him. But also answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes. So again, Proverbs are general truths. The reason for this is because Proverbs, the book of Proverbs and Proverbs in general, are not the source of wisdom. Proverbs are wisdom applied. God is our source of wisdom, and we go to Proverbs to see how might we apply this wisdom in certain areas. But God is the source of all wisdom, and so we need to go to God for that wisdom and to Proverbs to see it applied. But I want to return again to what I said. Proverbs are general truths presented in an absolute or even extreme way. So consider the modern proverb, practice makes perfect. Practice makes perfect? Really? Does practice really make things perfect? I mean, perfect is a really absolute or extreme word. I don't think practice makes perfect. Practice might make things much better, but even that is not as accurate as we could really be. If you wanted to make it really accurate, you'd say something like, consistent and careful practice is likely to make things much better. But all of a sudden you've got a terrible proverb because that's not how Proverbs work. Proverbs are black and white. They are short, sharp, and to the point. And so Proverbs are going to say things in ways that are very absolute and very extreme. And there is a good reason for this. It's because Proverbs are meant to be memorized. Proverbs are meant to be kept at hand for us to pull out and apply at the appropriate time. We're only going to be able to do that if we can memorize Proverbs, and we're only going to be able to memorize Proverbs if they are short, sharp, and to the point, even if it means that they're said in extreme or absolute ways. So again, Proverbs are general truths presented in an absolute way. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at this proverb that we're going to be exploring this morning. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 18 says, "One hiding hate has lying lips, and one spreading slander, that's a fool." Let me just read that again. One hiding hate has lying lips, and one spreading slander, that's a fool. All right, so if we focus in on that first line to start with, one hiding hate has lying lips. Now remember, this is a general truth presented in an absolute or extreme kind of way. And anything that's generally true is going to have exceptions. There's going to be exceptions to the rule. So let me just begin by exploring some of the times when this proverb might not be true. It may be the case that it is unwise for you to reveal hate or ill feeling, dislike towards someone. It may be the case where that is going to be unwise, that it's not going to lead to love, forgiveness, and reconciliation, but it's just going to lead to more conflict and broken relationships. In fact, earlier in this same chapter of Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 12, it says that hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. So before we just take this proverb and run with it, we need to consider the fact that is hate in this situation, is it going to stir up more conflict? Is it just going to make matters worse? And the other question we need to ask is, do we have that love that covers over all wrongs? It may be the case that rather than revealing hate and rather than hiding hate, maybe what we just need to do is let hate go. And it may be the case that that is what God is prompting you and enabling you to do. So I think that's probably the first place we need to start. Can we let go of hate? Rather than hiding hate, rather than revealing it, can we just let it go in those times where someone irritates us? But let's explore it a bit further. Let's explore maybe some times where this proverb is true as it stands. And now, the word hate might be a very extreme word, extreme way of talking here. I don't know about any of you, but it was almost like a swear word in my household growing up. We don't hate anyone in this household is kind of what I was taught. And so it is an extreme way of talking, but just like practice doesn't make things perfect, it makes things much better. In the same way, what we are hiding might not be hate, but maybe we might be hiding dislike or annoyance or ill will towards someone. Maybe someone's just irritating us a little bit, and that's what we're hiding. That's what we're keeping in the dark. And it may be tempting to kind of read this proverb and think, well, I don't hate anyone, so let's move on. I've got nothing to learn here. Well, let's take a closer look at this word, hate. See, in the Bible, this word refers to those people that we want to avoid. We see it appear in verses where someone is sent away from someone else. Just a couple of examples. Isaac says it about Abimelech in Genesis. You hate me and sent me away from you. Also, Japheth says it, did you hate me and drive me away from my father's household? So it's talking about separation. So while love draws near and unites, hate separates and keeps distant. So the question for us to consider is there anyone that we're avoiding? Is there anyone that we're trying to distance ourselves from? Are there any topics or conversations that we're avoiding? It might be the case that in those instances, we're hiding hate. Now, it might not be the case. Again, this is a general truth, not an absolute truth. We need wisdom from God. God is our source of wisdom. We need that prompting from God, and we need to have listening ears to hear God when he's saying, I think it's time to have that conversation. But perhaps God is also saying, I think it's time for you to let that go. I think it's time to stop dwelling on that moment, stop hiding it, stop pressing it down, just let go. So again, wisdom. I'm not going to know all the situations you might find yourself in, so it's important to listen to God in these moments. So, one hiding hate has lying lips. So the idea here is that if I have ill will towards someone, if I'm a bit irritated with someone, and yet everything I say is really nice and encouraging, like, oh, you're awesome, I love you, you're so great, and all these kinds of things, but inside I'm thinking, oh man, this guy. I'm kidding, you're kidding yourself, you know, if you're thinking like that, I'm lying. Not only am I lying to that person, but I'm lying to myself in those situations. That's not being honest, and yet it can feel like a very Christian thing to do, right? It can feel very Christian for us to conceal, to hide hate. We can say, I'm just loving my neighbor, we might say. And yet Jesus does address some things that are similar to this. He doesn't address hatred specifically, but he does address some similar things in Matthew 5 and 18. So in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, so if you're presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. On the flip side, Jesus says in Matthew 18, if another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, then you've won that person back. So whether someone has something against you or if you have something against someone else, the way of Jesus is to get it out into the open, to go speak directly with that person. Don't hide it. Don't conceal it. address it. Now, we can take this principle and apply it to hate as well, or to those lesser versions of hate, of dislike and annoyance and things. If it's something that needs to be addressed, and again, keep that asterisk there, it may be the case that we just need to let it go. But if it's something that's going to lead to reconciliation, then it's so important for us to have those hard but necessary conversations. And I think this is important because if we have in our heart hatred or annoyance or ill will towards someone, we should not be surprised if we see that seeping out into our conversations, into our words and actions and decisions, even into things like our tone of voice when we're around those people. These feelings, they have a way of getting out. But even more importantly, as this proverb indicates, we're making ourselves into a liar. When we see this play out in the story of Joseph, actually, with Joseph and his brothers. You might know this story. Joseph is the favorite son of his father, and his brothers hate him because of it. And to make matters worse, Joseph has this dream of him ruling over his brothers and decides to share it with them. And believe it or not, that doesn't help. Not a lot of wisdom in that moment, Joseph. And so his brothers hate him even more after sharing that dream. But rather than revealing their hatred, they seem to keep it covered up. So much so that when they sold Joseph into slavery, they ended up saying to their father, "Hey, I think an animal might have killed him." They're deceiving their own father. One hiding hate has lying lips. Now, to be clear, I doubt that any of us here are at risk of selling our sibling into slavery and then faking their death. So please hear me. I'm not saying that that is something that is on the table for any of us. However, we might find ourselves doing or saying things that compromise our own integrity for the sake of hiding hate. And I think, as another wise proverb says, it's better out than in. So maybe for some of you, this first line, that's the challenge. Maybe for some of you, you're a conflict avoider and you don't want to have those hard conversations. And so that first line of don't cover up that hate, don't hide it, have hard conversations for the sake of reconciliation and honest relationships. But maybe there's some of you who you're very comfortable telling people how you feel. Maybe for some of you, you're more than okay with letting people know if you have a problem with them. Grace and I watched a show recently, and there was this lady in there who would make some kind of tactless comments and rude comments, and she'd just say, "Oh, I tells it like I sees it." She'd say, "I tell it like I see it," all the time. And sometimes that can be a way of us allowing ourselves to speak in a way that doesn't build others up, but rather tears them down. We say, "I tell it like I see it." We say, "I'm just being honest," and that makes it okay. Well, this second line in the proverb, I think, is going to be a challenge in those situations. Because the proverb goes on to say, "One spreading slander, that's a fool." So it's kind of going to the equal and opposite extreme. You know, on one hand, you've got one hiding hate, one keeping those things private and not letting anyone know about it. On the other hand, you've got the other extreme, someone spreading slander, letting everyone know about something about this person that is defaming, something about this person that is a bad report. And we're going to talk about that word slander in just a moment. But you've got this foolish person who's the equal and opposite of the lying person in the first line. So, according to Proverbs, the one who's spreading slander, that's a fool. If you read through Proverbs, you're going to see these stock characters that keep on coming up. And one of those stock characters, these are kind of like exaggerated versions of people that we're all like. They're exaggerated versions of the kinds of people that we can be at certain times. And one of them is the fool. Now, the fool is this character in Proverbs who kind of blunders around in life, who doesn't listen to wisdom, but instead just does things that are a bit senseless. The fool is one who finds themselves in a mess of their own making. The fool is someone who is kind of one step removed from another character in Proverbs, the wicked. It's because they're not necessarily intentionally trying to do wrong, but because they don't listen to wisdom, they find themselves doing wrong again and again and again. And here, spreading slander is what the fool does, because this is the kind of thing that gets us into a mess. There's actually something that I didn't mention about the story of Joseph earlier. The story doesn't actually begin with Joseph's brothers hating him. It begins with Joseph telling his father, didn't include it in the slides, but in verse 2, you can fact check me, in verse 2 of Genesis 37, verse 2 of Genesis 37, you have Joseph bringing to his father a bad report about his brothers. This is the same word as in this proverb here. Joseph is bringing a slander about his brothers. Now, we're not told what he says, but we are told where it leads. It leads him into being sold into slavery, into his brothers hating him, and one thing leads to another. Once again, I'm not saying that any of us are going to find ourselves in the kinds of situations that Joseph found himself in, but I do think it's so important for us to be careful with our words. It's so important, something that comes up again and again, not only in Proverbs, but throughout the Bible, is the wisdom of holding our tongue, the wisdom of being careful with our words, because we may find ourselves in a mess of our own making. So it's not as if we can just be reckless with our words and just call it honesty. Just say, I tells it like I sees it. The Hebrew word translated slander here is the word dibar, and it means a bad report. There's a story in Numbers, you might remember this. It's a story of the spies that were sent to the land that God promised his people. And they were sent there to kind of scope out the land and see what it was like. And Caleb, one of the spies, came back and says, it's great. We should take possession of the land. I know that we're going to be successful. He seems to be trusting in the fact that God is with them. But the other spies don't see it that way. The other spies say that the people in the land are far too strong. And it says that they spread a bad report among the Israelites. They spread a bad report. This is the exact same phrase that's used in our proverb. But the thing is, it's not as if the spies were wrong. The people of that land were stronger than them, but they were presenting the truth in the worst possible light. It seems like they didn't take into account the fact that God was with them and that God had promised that land to them. So they were presenting the truth in the worst possible light. So let's return to our proverb here. The thing is, slander here refers to the truth presented in the worst possible light. So when someone does something that hurts you or frustrates you or irritates you, someone does something that stirs up hate within you, you have a choice. You have a choice as to how you interpret what they have done. You can give a charitable interpretation of what they've done, or a hostile interpretation of what they've done. You can view their actions in the best possible light, or you can view them in the worst possible light. So like, let's say that someone interrupts you in a conversation. You could think, well, they just don't value what I have to say, or they think that their opinion is more important than me. Or you could just think, man, they're so excited. They just can't wait to share their thoughts. Now, of course, that doesn't make interrupting in that situation necessarily okay, but it's still a more charitable interpretation. Or let's say someone criticizes you in public, someone criticizes you in front of others. Now you could think, well, they're trying to undermine me. They're trying to take away my voice. They're trying to shame me in front of others. That might be the case, but you could also think, well, they've just noticed an area where I can improve, and they're trying to help me in that. And now, again, they could perhaps do it better, but that doesn't mean that they're trying to publicly shame you. So there's always this opportunity, I think, to have a charitable interpretation of what others say or do. And sometimes for me, this exercise alone is enough to just let go of that hate, let go of that feeling, whatever it is, that little irritation. Just take a moment and think about the best interpretation. And if you're able to let go, then that's great. You're not hiding hate anymore. And in fact, Proverbs would suggest that speaking less is more preferable to speaking at all. In fact, the very next verse after the verse that we've been reading says that sin is not ended by multiplying words, but the prudent holds their tongue. And likewise, in the book of James, James says that we should be slow to speak and quick to listen. And so it's so important, I think, for us to be careful before we speak. During times where it's wise to have those conversations, we should first stop and pause and think about whether it's necessary. But if it is necessary, if it is the way to wisdom and the way to reconciliation with that person, if it is going to benefit our relationship, then let's follow the way of Jesus and speak privately with that person and give a charitable interpretation to tell the truth in the best possible light. All right, I want to invite the worship team up as I kind of come to a close here. And so what do we do when someone says or does something that kind of irritates you or frustrates you or offends you? What do we do when it kind of feels like someone's just getting in under our skin? Well, for those who tend to avoid conflict, maybe the challenge for you is to have those hard conversations. If you're someone who's more likely to push it down but not let it go, maybe the challenge for you is to go and have those hard but necessary conversations with someone, to speak privately and to give them the most charitable interpretation, but to actually do it, to step into those moments. But for those of you who are very comfortable sharing your opinions and maybe very quick to let someone know that they've offended you, maybe this is a time to pause and ask God to help you let it go, to help you to move on. Maybe it's for you, the challenge is saying, God, can you help me to move on from this moment? Proverbs encourages us to be slow to speak. But if we do speak, then let us present the truth in the best possible light. Let us have a charitable interpretation of other people's actions. If I could summarize it in just some practical terms here, I think that we need to begin with God. We need to begin with God's wisdom. God is the source of our wisdom. God is the one who is able to know intimately our situation. And let us allow him to prompt us and challenge us in ways that we might struggle to be challenged in. God is so ready to help you and give you the wisdom that you need to have relationships of reconciliation. And again, hold that charitable interpretation. How can I see that person's actions in the best light possible? Be slow to speak. Take the time to listen to other people's points of view, to not be quick to go to that conversation, but to take time and to hold your tongue. And then, if you are in that conversation, let us present the truth in the best possible light. To speak with such a way that is, what I like to do is I like to speak in a way that the other person is going to, speak in a way that the other person would say it. How would the other person say this? And try to present it in that kind of way. But I think we need God's help with this. And so as we enter into a time of worship, could I encourage you, could I invite you to enter into a conversation with God? If you're comfortable, this is not a requirement, of course. Invitation, not obligation. But in this time of worship, let us ask God, is there any situation where I'm carrying hate or irritation or frustration at the moment? And ask God for wisdom for what to do in that moment, considering all that we've said, but also just allowing God to say something fresh as well. So let me pray, and I invite you to have that conversation with God during worship. God, I thank you that you are the God of all wisdom. I thank you that you want us to have good and healthy and charitable relationships. I pray that you would help us to do that. I pray that you would prompt us to speak or prompt us to hold our tongue. I pray that you would give us the wisdom we need to have relationships of love, that as we say in our mission, that we can love Jesus and love like Jesus. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.